Scientists and engineers of Reddit, have you ever had a potentially catastrophic moment in your lab? I had a large washing machine sized centrifuge explode. Imagine it sounded like a bomb because I had tinnitus for a couple of days afterwards. That was 2 years ago and I am still wary of centrifuges. This is slightly unnerving. I'm sitting next to a large one that is running right now. I suddenly feel like it's just waiting to blow. I worked in flood defense as a civil engineering technician for a while, drawing up dams, correcting things as engineers altered specs, and while it was an office not a lab, our work directly affects the general public. We maintain and build nearly all of the UK sluices, floodgates, dams and weirs, rurally and urban. Anyway, one time there was this guy on his first project that he was managing, a prestigious but nerve-wracking experience for any civil engineer, and as usual site surveying is done, and they concluded that the bottom of the river at that point was concrete from a previous weir. This is obviously a really important part as this is where the new dam's nape and reinforced concrete will be seated. It turns out it wasn't concrete, it was a rock lobster. It was decades old twigs and mud compacted by the river and the installment over time to a consistency of concrete. For all intents and purposes, the bar was concrete by our readings. So the dam finally gets built and the guy is ready to go over his work and finalize and earn the company a buttload of money. Then, it dislodges from the crumbling ancient mud shit at the bottom and washes downstream, leaving debris and floodwater for miles. Apparently he needed about 6 months of counseling before he could even return to work. Infrastructure has its risks. A master's student in our lab needed some 100% ethanol which is stored in 5L glass bottles. He wanted it to be sterile so he took the near full bottle over to the Bunsen burner area to open it by a flame. Luckily, our lab tech stopped him before he blew up the lab. Just to explain a little more, yes, I think it was actually a 4L glass bottle of ethanol. I would have to check tomorrow in the lab. We buy high grade, 99.8% ethanol as we do lots of sensitive molecular biology work. The guy was doing a 1-year master's, where he rotated around 3 different labs before starting a 3-year PhD. These were specially funded by the Wellcome Trust and anyone on these courses were considered to be the brightest of students. I think he was adding the ethanol to some sterile media to grow cultures in, and even though for most purposes 100% ethanol is sterile, he wanted to use aseptic techniques and a Bunsen burner. I was at the other end of the lab when I hear shouting. The lab tech is like, "What are you doing? That's ethanol," and the guy just stands there and says, "But it needs to be sterile." My first science type job when I was a sophomore in college. I was sort of the undergrad chemistry TA for the small community college I went to. There was only one chemistry professor and he had just replaced the old professor a month before I started. The old chem professor left the chemical storage area in a horrible state of neglect and danger and I was tasked with helping clean it up. Included in the mess was some random piece of glassware from decades ago that had at least 2 pounds of mercury in it. An old broken mercury barometer. I don't know how nobody noticed a pool of mercury on the floor. Don't know how long it was there. Quite a health hazard. And a shoebox full of vials labeled A, B, and C containing either white or bluish powder. I don't know what he was thinking, but the new professor instructed me to empty all of vials into an empty glass container to have picked up when the chemical waste guys come. At the time I wasn't the safety oriented scientist I am now, so I didn't question it and started working. After 5 or 6 vials I noticed some sort of reaction taking place, so I call out the professor's name and he walks in just as the mixture in the glass container starts to smoke. He grabs it and throws it in the fume hood and slams the door shut just as it bursts into flames and lets out plumes of dark brown smoke. I have been very careful with all of my work and labs since then. I am a nuclear engineer and typically work in and around the control rooms. Avoiding catastrophes is our business, so thankfully nothing went fatally wrong. But the most hair-raising event went as follows. Bad storms were playing havoc with the network, and we had been warned we might lose our connection. We were making all the preparations we could, but some systems were out for maintenance, so we expected trouble. In the early hours of the morning, the worst happened and a tree fell on the power line, cutting us off and tripping our main transformer. The system starts running down, and it looks like everything is safe. Some of the most essential systems are supported by a no-break electrical system, using batteries to keep them propped up when we are in transitional situations. One of the transformers that supported this was out for work. Unfortunately, in the chaos the other transformer exploded. The no-break supplies came to the rescue, but one of the motor alternator sets didn't start, so the board couldn't power up properly. We had lost supplies to the seal oil system. The seal oil system maintains the seals around the generator, which is filled with hydrogen for maximum heat conduction. We've lost the system, and the generator is spinning down, so we had just a few minutes until gas started leaking, and a fire or explosion started. If anyone hasn't seen a turbine generator explosion, imagine 500 tons of steel shrapnel flying for a couple of miles in every direction. The control room was pretty much useless at that point. The reactor was safe, managed by automatic protection systems, and displays were clogged up with over 72,000 unique alarms. The only thing to do was throw on a helmet and run towards the potential turbine death trap. Once we arrived, we had to purge the generator with CO2 as fast as we could to block the explosion. If we had been even a few minutes later, we could have easily been disintegrated in the fireball, and half the building leveled from the world's largest shotgun. At the time it didn't scare me, but once I got home it took the better part of a bottle of whiskey to get to sleep. TLDR. I rode a nuclear shotgun to heck and back. Whiskey was involved. Late one night when I was in grad school, my friend from high school is visiting me. It's about 10:30 PM and I wanted to drop by lab to pick up my laptop so we could use it while kicking back a few drinks. I also wanted to show him the lab since we had some really awesome equipment that I knew he would appreciate. On the way, on the first floor, my lab is on the second, and I see the department head and another professor on the first floor. It's not unusual to see professors around that late, but the department head is usually out much earlier. As I get closer I wave hello, but he stops, looks at me with a stern face and shouts down the hall, "Direct Delta Funct, there is a problem in your lab." That's the moment I look down and notice he is wearing waders and he's standing in several inches of water. Instantly my face goes white as I remember I had just changed water lines on a diffusion pump earlier that afternoon and thought they failed to hold. They dump a total for 4 gallons min through all the pumps. I rush upstairs to find everything submerged under 6-8 inches of water, including a $100K laser power supply and many high voltage boxes. As it turns out it wasn't my fault and a water line on the top floor broke and dumped thousands of gallons down through the building. In total it flooded our lab, frying all the power supplies, missed dumping on an $80K amplifier by 1 foot, filled several laser tables with water, ruining them with rust, and completely flooded a clean room below us. It could have been worse, but it set back research for us by months and others by years and probably over $500,000 in damages. Thank God for insurance. I had a friend who washed a large chunk of pure potassium down the sink. That went bad quickly. For those who don't know, potassium catches fire in water. During high school, we had a particularly intelligent guy in our lab that decided to light a beaker full of some sort of alcohol on fire. The genius decided that the best way of doing this would be to hold the beaker in one hand and then drop a match into the beaker. Surprise, surprise, alcohol burns. The guy was amused. Cool dude, it burns, haha. Then he learned that fire is also hot and that a flaming beaker also gets hot. Oh crap man, it's hot. Dang, then the guy decided the best course of action to avoid burning his hand was to throw the beaker on the ground. The beaker exploded in a massive fireball and about half of the lab was on fire. People on the side of the lab that is now engulfed in flame are screaming as everyone on the other side is just staring in awe. Then from the front of the room, desks being thrown out of the way and a rallying cry of "Jesus frick" is heard as our teacher rushes into action and manages to put out the inferno before any real damage is done. During another unrelated instance, we had a kid that same year managed to stab some glass tubing into his hand while trying to put it into a stopper. Blood came shooting out of the tube and the kid just stood there not knowing what to do. The teacher nonchalantly came over and suggested the kid come with him to nurse. There was a huge puddle of blood on the floor and trailed all the way down the hallway. Then during college, someone managed to tip over an entire cart of chemicals while trying to get it out of an elevator and they had to call in the hazmat team and the fire department. The entire building was evacuated. TLDR. Kid starts lab on fire. different kid stabs himself, and cart of chemicals gets dumped. So, the first guy basically set off a Molotov cocktail in the lab. Oh man, I could go on for days. I work as a lab tech in labs with about 400 scientists. I also work very closely with the H&S officer of my labs, so get to hear all the stories. Plus I'm a first aider, so get to see them firsthand. Hydrogen peroxide, good for bleaching your hair when diluted, right? We vaporize it and pump it into chemical safety cabinets to sterilize them. One day we had an engineer to look at our VHP machine. Something happened and he ended up cleaning up a small hydrogen peroxide spill with paper towel and threw it in the bin. Apparently he didn't know that when concentrated hydrogen peroxide evaporates, it can spontaneously combust, along with the other contents of the bin. Luckily that was only a small fire. Made the day a bit more fun anyway. How about another? We have cold rooms inside the labs for groups to store their samples etc that are too big to go into fridges. Well, one evening a group gets a delivery that's on dry ice, but nobody can be bothered to deal with it as they are getting ready to go home. So they decide to stick the whole box into the cold room, even though the box had enough dry ice to keep the samples cold for at least another 24 hours. Fast forward to the next day and some guy goes into the cold room to start sorting through his samples. Apparently he started to feel a bit lightheaded. Next thing he knows he's on the lab floor surrounded by first aiders and other scientists. Turns out the dry ice had been evaporating all night, filling the room with CO2. This guy goes in and promptly passes out from lack of oxygen. Microwaves are also fun in labs. We use them to melt gels to set up gel electrophoresis experiments. Only problem is if you're not careful you can boil the gel and cause it to erupt out of the flask, filling the microwave with gel. Sometimes you aren't so lucky. Sometimes you can end up superheating the gel. When this happens everything looks fine, until you take it out of the microwave and give it a quick shake. Suddenly it all boiled at once and goes everywhere, usually straight into the face of the person that's just got it out of the microwave. Luckily the 2 times this has happened the person has been smart enough to be wearing fire safety glasses. Otherwise it would have been a lot worse. Not that nasty burns to the face and neck aren't bad enough. Turns out the dry ice had been evaporating all night. Sublimating, not evaporating. Guy left a puddle in a liquid hydrogen container boiling off overnight. Came back next day and switched on light. People 7 floors above thought there was a terrorist attack. Insanely smart PhD student fired a vacuum gun the wrong way. 5 kilograms maraging steel projectile embedded itself in wall. I worked at a cement plant as a process engineer. One of my jobs was to work with the lab chemist to ensure quality control on our cement chemistry. One day, we were sitting in his office discussing which section of quarry to work from next to gain the most efficient run for the year based on availability of other reagents. Suddenly, we hear a loud bang, and a hole about the size of a quarter appears in the wall between his office and the lab, and another on the opposite wall to the outside. At first, we thought it was from the explosives used to blast away a section of the quarry, and it was a piece of rock that managed to make it up to the plant. Not unheard of, but rarely something that's dangerous. Turns out, the pressure tester, which applies pressure to a block of set concrete to test the yield strength, had been left on while one of the techs went on break. Although the cement gave way at around 3000 C, the tester caught on a bit of rock in the concrete mix, hitting around 10 kc before it ejected the rock like a bullet. Broke the pressure tester too. Oh man, I love those things. Nothing quite like putting a cylinder of high strength concrete in it. They explode like a bomb. D. Outside of my lab actually, one of the workers was bringing me a small steel plate on forklift for testing purposes. He forgot that he had it on and slammed the brakes in front of me. The plate swung about 1 feet from my head to the wall. I was a bit pee. No heads were lost that day though. Don't ever think you can chill a bottle of Coca-Cola in one of the -80 C freezers. And especially don't forget about it too. Coke everywhere. For a senior design project, our group decided to make a UAV. I can't recall the exact situation in the code that caused this, but the goddamn thing tried to take off inside the lab. The UAV was already strapped down, but it had some seriously powerful electric engines. The failsafe disconnect was near the cockpit of the UAV. In the fray of pulling the failsafe to prevent catastrophe, the propellers nicked my hand and really cut into one of my group members' hand. Got blood all over the walls. If it had gotten free, the resulting chaos would have been pretty intense considering the size of the frame. Sometime before that it had also hit a bus. At least it was an interesting project. The failsafe disconnect was near the cockpit of the UAV. That is not a failsafe. That is a fail dangerously. Somebody mixed around 30 kilograms of chlorine dioxide 20% with 4 kilograms of hydrochloric acid 32%. It kinda felt like World War I. I required a set of better reading glasses after that accident. Somebody. I am no scientist, but I do like to tinker with electronics and experiment with science. What I have learned. 1. Never touch that little suction cup on top of the tube inside a CRT monitor. You'll black out, if you're lucky. 2. Hydrogen is way more flammable than you might think. 3. A bright enough light will catch things on fire. Story 1. In middle school we were doing an experiment in chemistry using hydrochloric acid. I don't remember the exact steps, but it was focusing on the exothermic nature of the reaction. As a result, we were supposed to notice that the reaction was hot. How did we do this? Why? By feeling the beaker it was in and noticing it was warm. Simply enough, the directions told us to touch the bottom of the beaker. This one poor girl didn't think her logic all the way though, as she decided that the best way to feel the bottom of the beaker would be the inside of it rather than the outside. So she reached in and submerged her hand in the acid to feel the bottom of the beaker. Good thing this was middle school and the acid was incredibly dilute, or she would have done intense damage to her hand. I think she just got some irritation, which, in the end, is not that bad considering you just washed your hands in hydrochloric acid. She blamed the teacher because the instructions were unclear. He appended the instructions to state not to feel acid with your hands. Story 2. Not mine but my father's. My father is an electrical engineer and does a great deal of work with chemical process plants. At one of these projects they had just finished installing a distillation tower. They needed to bring it online to make sure everything worked, so they go to operations and light it up. And light it up they did. The tower burst into flames and there was much scrambling to turn it off and put out the flames. Here is where the logic of a normal person and a room full of engineers diverges. The normal person would say, hey, it must be broken. We need to fix it. The room full of engineers say, hey, I wonder if it does that every time. Back off to operations they go to try again. Seconds later they get their answer. It does, in fact, do that every time. Emergency shutdowns and fire protocols were engaged for the second time that day. They did not try a third time. Just a couple of weeks ago we all got sent home early because of a nitrogen leak. Incidentally, it was the day after that new COD game came out. I'm on to you, men. This one time we had a 70% nitrogen leak in our lab's air system. Terrifying crap, I know. I worked as a research assistant in a BSL-3 plant pathology lab at a well-known research university. Our work studied an exotic highly virulent stem rust pathogen. The spores can be transmitted by air over hundreds of miles and cause 70%-80% crop losses. All rooms in a BSL-3 operate at negative pressure and all air is cycled through ULPA filters. Think HEPA on steroids, among many other safety measures. This means even if all of the airlocks are opened, airborne pathogens cannot escape because of the pressure imbalance. Now you have the background. Here's how we nearly had a catastrophe. A couple weeks before we moved into the lab greenhouses, a fire alarm went off erroneously. Usually, SOP says a special unit of the fire department should come out. They know how to handle fires in special facilities. However, regular Olay fire people came because the building was new. They propped open all the doors as they evacuated the lab and greenhouses. The air system is powerful but cannot pull enough air to compensate for all the doors being open for an extended period of time. More alarms went off as the different air pressures equilibrated. Pretty much, the US wheat crop could have been decimated if this would have happened once our project had moved in. It only takes one spore to infect a plant and produce thousands of more spores. TLDR. Dumb firemen could have wiped out North American wheat crops. Admins, let's PM to verify. I left the chuck key in the lathe once, and then turned the lathe on. throwing the chucky. Nobody got hurt, but it was still one of the most terrifying things I have ever witnessed. The machine shop manager at my school is known for kicking people out of the shop for taking their hands off the chucky while it is in the chuck. A bit harsh, but in the 19 years he has worked there, there have only been 2 accidents in the shop. Doing some very basic chemistry experiments in school, and as the class is coming to the end, the teacher asks everyone to start tidying up. Instead of washing the spatula in the sink like any normal person, this girl decides to lick it clean like a spoon. The look on my teacher's face was spectacular as he rushed her to hospital. She was fine. Laughing so hard right now, I had to read your comments to a few co-workers. My forensic chemistry lab demonstrator decided to show us the emergency shower and how it worked. Drenched himself and pretty much the entire row of students in front of the shower, and then he slipped and fractured his hip while getting paper towels. Not as explosive as the other stories on here, but we all thought it was quite a disaster. Also, I broke a burette once and thought it was the end of the world. I'm not a scientist, but in middle school we had a lab where we had a D battery to test conductivity of various materials, and for some reason we had steel wool. I heard that the two could make fire, so like an innocent 8th grade pyromaniac I rubbed them together. Burned my partner and my worksheet to ash and got a few 2nd-degree burns on my hands. My teacher didn't make us read the worksheet. TLDR. Steel wool plus battery equals fire. During my junior year, I was doing some undergrad research in a marine biogeochemistry lab. No really, that's what the sign on the door said. Particularly, we were examining isotopic ratios of dissolved organic carbon in marine pore water sediment. Anyway, this involved a lot of work manipulating CO2. Is there a subscript option on Reddit? For those of you who are not aware, CO2 is a gas at many temperatures, including room temperature, which makes it very difficult to work with and keep contained. Therefore, many samples had to be sealed in glass, quartz, containers with the use of a propane O2 blowtorch at about 850 degrees Celsius. I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit, but probably pretty scary, regardless of what temperature scale you use. As if the blowtorch was not intimidating enough, I would typically be using the torch with the flame inches away from my bare hand. But wait, there's more. On the other side of my hand, just below, was an open container of liquid nitrogen, or LN2 for short. So picture my hand, in between a flame 850 degrees Celsius and a liquid surface of minus 200 degrees Celsius. All the while, I am trying to concentrate, melting and manipulating the glass in a particular way. There's one final trick to this act though. The portion of the glass vessel I am holding is being heated by the flame over time, so this whole performance is not only potentially disastrous, but I am timed throughout. Also, I'm wearing dark green safety glasses that make it difficult to see anything that is not a flame. So anyway, I had been doing this for quite some time. I had become pretty comfortable with the process. I had begun to listen to music and even dance a little during this maneuver. So there I am, dancing, singing along to Blink 182, and with my hand in between the flame and the LN2. I hadn't gotten enough sleep the night before, and the phone rings at that very important moment. I lose my concentration just long enough for the glass vessel I'm holding to heat up enough to burn me. Naturally, my reaction is to freak out and drop everything. I mean everything. The blowtorch goes up into the air, propelled up by my arms jerking back. Even with the safety glasses on, I can see the flame approach my face. This is one of those rare moments in your life where you are flooded with adrenaline. The whole thing seems to play out in slow motion. I even remember it moving slowly in the mind. I lean back, doing my best Neo bullet dodge. I avoid getting my face burned. However, I now have no vision of the blowtorch as it begins to fall to the ground. I'm still very panicked, my view now directed at the ceiling. After what felt like quite some time, I hear the loud, metallic clang of the torch hitting the floor. Breathing rapidly, I look down to see the blowtorch had landed, flame still alight and pointing upward, between my legs. I turn the gas valves to their off position and sit down for a while. Action, suspense, possibly bullet time, A++ comment. Story from my school technology teacher about when he was in school. His teacher wanted to teach about the explosive properties of hydrogen and oxygen. So he fills a balloon with oxygen, grabs the nubby with his fingers and holds a match to it. The balloon explodes, creating a small puff around the size of the balloon. Next he fills a balloon with hydrogen gas. He grabs the nubby with pliers, holds it at an arm's distance and puts a match to it. It explodes more violently with a small fireball a little bigger than the size of the balloon. The kids are amazed he this, but he is not finished yet. His lesson is based around how, yes, both are explosive alone, but together they are a lot more reactive. So the teacher fills a third balloon with half hydrogen half oxygen. The then tapes it to the table, puts a match on the end of a yardstick, grabs the yardstick with pliers and stands arm fully stretched out and touches the balloon. This reaction creates a 10-foot diameter fireball, floor to ceiling of the classroom, and a shockwave powerful enough to push the ceiling tiles out of their slots, raining fiberglass insulation down on the students, and shaky cabinets that lined the room and the glassware inside them. Half the teachers in the building came running thinking the worst. TLDR teacher creates 10-foot fireball, not allowed to do the experiment indoors anymore. Yes, once I forgot to return a helium tank in time to the cryo lab. The helium is stored at 4K and slowly boils away. This is fine as long as the liquid helium keeps the helium gas cold. Once you run out of liquid helium, the gas heats up quickly and expands. Worst case is that the thing blows off pieces of metal through walls. In my case, the emergency relief valve didn't work properly and bent out of shape. Could have been worse. I was present when the inside of a fume hood collapsed. That was scary. Chemical residue falling forcefully sounded like thunder, and the cloud that floated out into the lab was horrifying. One day a colleague of mine was carrying a higher order function. His hand jerked, and lambda expressions spilled all over the lab. He would have had third-degree formal burns if he wasn't wearing a lab coat. Computer science is hard crap. Unfortunately, I cannot say what I do, where I work, etc, but past all of the oxidizable explosion deaths, people falling into reactors after whiffing nitrogen, etc, we trickle down the vat of apocalyptic to my catastrophic event. I was pushing a large heap of vac we use to clean up residue from whatever it is I work with. These vacuums are new, and we were excited to use them as they drastically decreased the cleanup time after a procedure. Unfortunately for us, our materials are of unknown toxicity, potentially carcinogenic, and even a tad bit deadly, or so the tales go, as, once again, we know very little about the material. So there I am, pushing this vacuum with this unknown, deadly material inside it, with only a lab coat and safety goggles. Z87 represent, and I hit a bump between doors. Apparently this was enough to dislodge the poorly placed collection chamber on the vacuum, which was the belly side of the machine. I kept going and, lo and behold, plot, a huge plume of unknowns flows up into the air. I immediately cover my face with my coat and back up slowly. After a minute, when the plume has settled, I calmly walked over to my nearest lab, asked a co-worker to get some barricade tape and informed him of the issue. I stripped down, put on a cleanroom suit with a respirator and get to work cleaning up the mess, shutting down the whole area for a long while. The plus side is that we now know the material isn't an acutely deadly. The downside is, I may be sterile and full of cancer. Even worse, I had to waste a few hours machining a few safety latches to prevent that from happening again. I think the guy who put a nitrogen line into his coveralls was onto something, though legend has it, he was caught by his manager the first time and he lied saying he thought it was an air line and was using it to cool him down. Dead a few hours later via nitrogen after doing it again. TLDR, OP is probably dying from unknowns due to a stupid design flaw in a heap of vacuum. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.